The golden glow of Beverly Hills sunset filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of producer David Wolper's Bel Air mansion as Hollywood's elite gathered for what would become the most talked-about generational confrontation in entertainment history. September 18, 1976. Al Pacino stood near the Marble Bar, nursing a scotch and observing the carefully orchestrated mingling of old and new Hollywood royalty. At 36, he'd conquered cinema with the Godfather trilogy and Serpico, but in this room filled with legends who'd built the industry before he was born, he still felt the weight of proving himself to men whose careers had defined American masculinity for decades. But what happened in the next hour would prove that some definitions of toughness were about to change forever. The party was Wolper's attempt to bridge the growing gap between Hollywood's established elite and the new generation of actors who were revolutionizing American cinema. The guest list read like a who's who of entertainment history: Clark Gable's contemporaries mixing with Coppola's Young Turks, studio system veterans sharing space with method acting rebels who'd learned their craft in grimy New York theaters rather than sunny California sound stages. Al found himself studying the social dynamics with fascination. The old guard moved through Wolper's mansion with the casual confidence of men who'd never doubted their place in the industry hierarchy. They spoke in the clipped tones of people raised on studio lots, their conversations peppered with references to battles fought and won before television had changed everything. The new generation, directors like Scorsese and Coppola, actors like De Niro and Hoffman, carried themselves differently. They had the intensity of people who'd had to fight for every opportunity, who understood that their success came from talent and dedication rather than studio contracts and publicity departments. But dominating both groups through sheer physical presence and legendary status was John Wayne. The Duke commanded the center of Wolper's living room like a frontier sheriff surveying his territory. At 69, Wayne remained the undisputed symbol of American masculinity, 6 feet 4 inches of weathered confidence, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never backed down from a fight, real or cinematic. When John Wayne spoke, conversations stopped. When he moved, people made room. When he expressed an opinion, even other legends listened with respectful attention. Al had been watching Wayne hold court for the past hour, noting how the legendary actor's presence seemed to diminish everyone around him, not through cruelty or arrogance, but through the simple force of being John Wayne, the man who'd defined what it meant to be tough on screen for over 40 years. Pacino. Wayne's voice boomed across the living room, cutting through multiple conversations like a cavalry charge through enemy lines. "Come over here, son. I want to talk to you." The room went quiet as every guest understood they were about to witness something significant. John Wayne didn't casually summon other actors for conversations. When the Duke wanted to talk to someone, it usually meant he had something important to say. Al walked across the marble floor with measured steps, his movement controlled but carrying none of the deference that other actors typically showed when approaching Hollywood royalty. When he reached Wayne's circle, he nodded respectfully but didn't extend his hand until Wayne offered his first. "Al Pacino," Wayne said, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when sizing up another man. "Hell of a thing you did with that Godfather picture. Hell of a thing." "Thank you, Mr. Wayne," Al replied, his voice respectful but not submissive. "Call me Duke," Wayne said, his pale eyes studying Al with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating men under pressure. "I've been watching your work, son. You and your generation of actors." Al waited, sensing that Wayne was building towards something larger than simple professional courtesy. "And I have to say," Wayne continued, his voice taking on the tone of an elder statesman delivering judgment, "I'm concerned about where this business is heading." Several guests moved closer, recognizing that the Duke was about to deliver one of his famous observations about the state of American entertainment. "Used to be," Wayne said, his voice gaining strength, "actors were men. Real men. We showed up on set ready to work, we did our jobs without a lot of psychological nonsense, and we understood that our responsibility was to entertain audiences, not indulge our own artistic pretensions." The criticism was subtle but unmistakable. Wayne was drawing a line between his generation of performers and the method actors who'd revolutionized Hollywood in the past decade. But your generation, Wayne continued, his gaze focusing directly on Al, you've turned acting into something complicated. All this method acting business, all this talk about finding the character and psychological truth, it's made the whole profession soft. The word soft hung in the air like a challenge. In John Wayne's universe, there was no greater insult than questioning another man's toughness. I've watched you in interviews talking about spending months preparing for roles, getting inside characters' heads, exploring their inner lives, Wayne said, his tone suggesting he found such concepts fundamentally unmanly. And I keep thinking, when did acting become therapy? When did entertainment become so self-indulgent? Al remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his expression unchanged. But everyone present could sense that something was building beneath his composed exterior. Don't get me wrong, Wayne continued, perhaps mistaking Al's silence for acceptance, you're talented. Hell, you're more than talented. But this whole generation of actors, you've made the profession soft. You've turned what used to be a man's job into something that requires emotions and feelings and all this psychological hand-wringing. Wayne looked around the room, taking in faces that included some of Hollywood's most powerful people, all of them listening with the attention that the Duke's opinions always commanded. In my day, Wayne said, his voice taking on the nostalgic tone of someone who believed the past was superior to the present, actors were tough. We took direction, we hit our marks, we delivered our lines, and we understood that our job was to project strength on screen. We didn't need months of preparation to play tough guys, we were tough guys. The implicit comparison was devastating. Wayne was essentially telling Al that his entire approach to acting was a symptom of generational weakness, that method acting was what happened when soft men tried to portray the kind of characters that Wayne's generation had embodied naturally. But your generation, Wayne continued, his voice gaining edge, you need all this psychological preparation because you don't have real toughness to draw from. You have to manufacture it through method and research, because it's not naturally there. Al's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent, understanding that John Wayne was building towards something that would require a response. That's what I mean by soft generation, Wayne concluded, his pale eyes fixed on Al's face. You've got talent, son, but you and actors like you have made this business soft. You've turned masculine roles into exercises in sensitivity. The silence that followed was electric and dangerous. John Wayne had just publicly questioned not only Al's toughness but that of his entire generation, in front of Hollywood's most influential people. When Al finally spoke, his words would prove that the Duke's definition of toughness was about to be challenged in ways he'd never imagined. When Al finally spoke, his words would prove that the Duke's definition of toughness was about to be challenged in ways he'd never imagined. The silence in David Wolper's living room stretched beyond what party guests were accustomed to experiencing during social gatherings. Al remained motionless, his dark eyes focused on John Wayne's weathered face with an intensity that seemed to make everyone else in the room fade into background. When he finally broke his silence, his voice carried a quality that made every person present lean forward despite themselves. "Duke," Al said quietly, "can I tell you what I learned about toughness?" Wayne nodded, perhaps expecting a defensive explanation or respectful acknowledgement of generational differences. "I learned it from a man named Vincent Mara," Al began, his voice taking on the controlled power that had made him famous. 73 years old, ran numbers in East Harlem for 40 years. When I was preparing for Serpico, he told me something I'll never forget. The room was completely quiet now, every guest understanding that Al's response was going somewhere none of them had anticipated. He said that real toughness isn't about what you show the world, Al continued, his voice gaining strength. It's about what you're willing to face inside yourself when nobody's watching. When everything you believe about right and wrong is being tested by people who can destroy your life. Al stepped closer to Wayne, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building energy that made several guests shift uncomfortably. "You want to know what method acting really is, Duke?" Al asked, his voice taking on the passionate intensity that had defined his greatest performances. It's not therapy. It's not self-indulgence. It's the willingness to risk your psychological stability to find authentic human truth. Wayne's confident expression flickered slightly, perhaps sensing that this wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from someone he'd just publicly challenged. When I prepared to play Michael Corleone, Al said, his voice building with controlled power, I didn't just put on a suit and practice looking tough. I spent 2 years learning what it costs a man to choose family loyalty over personal morality. I explored what happens when good people make evil choices for reasons they can justify. Al looked around the room, taking in faces that included some of Hollywood's most powerful people, all of them watching with fascination as he systematically dismantled Wayne's critique. And I learned something that you can't learn from hitting your marks and delivering lines, Al continued, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone present suddenly more alert. I learned that the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or guns. They're fought in the space between who you are and who you have to become to survive. The devastation was building, but Al was just getting started. You talk about manufacturing toughness through method and research, Al said, his voice gaining intensity. But let me tell you what real research looks like, Duke. For Frank Serpico, I didn't just wear a police uniform and practice looking honest. Al's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow carried more power than if he'd been shouting. I rode with undercover narcotics officers in Bedford-Stuyvesant at 3 in the morning, watching them make drug buys from people who would kill them without hesitation if they discovered the truth. I watched men risk their lives every night to protect communities that sometimes hated them for trying. Wayne stood perfectly still, his legendary composure beginning to show cracks as Al continued his systematic dismantling of everything the Duke thought he understood about toughness. And I learned what it means to be the only clean cop in a corrupt precinct, Al said, his voice building with passionate conviction. To choose integrity when corruption is easier, safer, and more profitable. To risk everything for principles that most people only talk about. Al stepped even closer to Wayne, close enough that everyone watching understood this had moved beyond polite disagreement into something more fundamental and dangerous. That's not soft, Duke, Al said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. That's tougher than anything you've ever portrayed on screen. Because when you play tough guys, you know the script ends in 90 minutes. When you live as one, you never know if you'll survive until morning. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. John Wayne, the man who'd defined American masculinity for 40 years. Stood speechless as Al continued his education in what authentic toughness actually required. But you want to know what really separates our generations? Al asked, his voice taking on a new quality that commanded absolute attention. Wayne nodded, though his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Your generation played tough guys for audiences who wanted to believe that strength was simple, Al said, his voice gaining power. You projected an image of masculinity that was clean, uncomplicated, and ultimately safe. Good guys wore white hats, bad guys wore black hats, and justice always prevailed through superior firepower. Al looked directly into Wayne's pale eyes, his gaze carrying the kind of focused intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. But my generation explores what happens when good and evil aren't clearly defined, Al continued, his voice building towards something that would fundamentally challenge Wayne's entire worldview. When justice requires compromising your principles. When protecting innocent people forces you to become someone you never wanted to be. The room was electric with tension now, everyone present understanding that they were witnessing a fundamental clash between two different definitions of strength and masculinity. You think we're soft because we explore psychological complexity, Al said, his voice taking on the controlled menace that had made him famous. But psychological complexity is what separates real toughness from the kind you can fake for cameras. Al paused, letting his words settle over the silent living room like a judgment. Because anyone can pretend to be tough when they know the director will yell, "Cut," if things get too dangerous, Al said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying more devastating power than any shout. But it takes real strength to explore the parts of human nature that most people spend their lives avoiding. To risk your sanity understanding what ordinary people become when pushed beyond their moral limits. Wayne remained completely still, his legendary quick wit apparently deserting him for the first time in decades of public appearances. "So when you call my generation soft, Duke," Al said, his voice returning to respectful tones while maintaining its underlying steel, "remember that we chose depth over surface, authenticity over image, and psychological truth over comfortable fantasy." Al straightened his jacket with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. "Your generation taught audiences that strength was about never showing weakness," Al said, delivering what would become the most quoted response in Hollywood party history. "My generation teaches them that real strength is about having the courage to show weakness when it serves authentic human truth." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds before someone near the back of the room began to applaud. Within moments, the entire party was giving Al a standing ovation that lasted over 2 minutes, not for attacking John Wayne, but for defending artistic integrity with such passionate conviction. Wayne stood motionless throughout the applause, his face showing something that guests would later describe as a mixture of surprise, respect, and genuine recognition. When the applause finally died down, he extended his hand to Al. "Son," Wayne said, his voice carrying none of its earlier condescension, "I think I may have underestimated what your generation brings to this business." Al shook Wayne's hand firmly, his grip respectful but not deferential. "Duke, I learned everything I know about screen presence from watching actors like you," Al replied. "But I hope our generation can build on that foundation by adding psychological truth to physical presence." Years later, when entertainment journalists wrote about the relationship between old and new Hollywood, Al's response to John Wayne would be cited as a defining moment, proof that artistic evolution didn't require disrespecting the past, but could honor tradition while pushing the boundaries of what performance could accomplish. Wayne never again made dismissive comments about method acting, and privately told friends that his encounter with Al Pacino had taught him to respect the dedication required for psychological authenticity, even if it wasn't his own approach to the craft. The story spread through Hollywood within days, not as gossip about a celebrity confrontation, but as a lesson in defending artistic integrity while maintaining respect for different approaches to the same craft. Al had silenced John Wayne not through disrespect or attack, but by demonstrating that toughness could exist in forms the Duke had never considered, and that the newest generation of actors was tough enough to explore territories that even legendary tough guys had never dared to enter.